Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me back to UCT. It's lovely to see this lecture hall packed once more. But just to give me some idea what you do, I'd like you to put up your hand if you are in the science division, essentially, in the sciences, okay? Right, hands down. People who would regard themselves in the humanities. Wonderful. So that's roughly half and half, I think, which delights me because I'm, in a sense, equally interested in both. We're going to talk about the question, is God a delusion? And there are different sets of questions that come to us dependent on our discipline. I'm a pure mathematician by background, and as you know, pure mathematics is the most compressed form of language. So I've been very interested in language and linguistics since I was a small boy. And so I'm fascinated by the humanities and the way in which language conveys ideas, especially the precise ideas that are representative of my own discipline of mathematics. Now, we're going to talk about evidence for God, not proof for God, for a very simple reason, because you only get proof in the rigorous sense in my own discipline of pure mathematics. Proof in ordinary language has two meanings. It's got the rigorous mathematical one. You don't get that in physics, you don't get that in chemistry or anywhere else. What we can talk about there is evidence. And that doesn't mean it's weak evidence. I trusted myself to a British Airways aircraft, and maybe that was a foolish thing to do, but I did coming out here. I staked my life on it. I couldn't prove to you mathematically it was going to get me to Cape Town, but I had to stake my life on it. I've been married to the same girl for 46 years. I couldn't prove to you mathematically that she loves me, but I'd stake my life on it. Do you get the idea? So we can have sufficient evidence to make major commitments without having mathematical proof. Now the question is God a delusion? And we're going to have it in two parts because I want to give you time for questions. I remember the last time I was here, I got some fantastic questions. So please listen with questions in mind. And if you can write your question down, it'll mean that we can collect them faster because you can read them out when I call on you to do so. Listen with questions in your mind and you'll be engaged much more in what I'm going to say. We're going to have two parts, and what's going to come tomorrow will depend on how far we get today. So we'll just have to leave you in a little bit of suspense about all of that. I was debating in the Netherlands not long ago, and I was faced with two very different kinds of professor. One was a very famous professor of physics, and the other was a professor of sociology in two different universities. And what was very interesting to me was the first objection they brought up was, your God is a delusion and belief in God is like belief in Santa Claus. And I thought how very fascinating. So I challenged the audience. I said to them, how many of you came to believe in Santa Claus as an adult? And there was absolute silence. And then I asked them, how many of you came to believe in God as an adult? And many hands went up. It is foolishly naive to put God into the place of Santa Claus. Adults don't come to believe in Santa Claus because there's no evidence. Adults do come to believe in God because there is evidence. But I want to dig under that objection because it's part of our title. And Richard Dawkins has written a famous book, The God Delusion, about it, as you know. And it really goes back to Freud, who thought that religion in general was an illusion and God was a delusion. And often that is the major objection that stops many students even beginning to think about God. So I want to think about that Freudian objection. And I'm helped in this because there's been a very brilliant book written by Germany's leading psychiatrist. You see, if you claim God is a delusion, you're actually using a psychiatric term to describe belief in God. Now, you will know by my pedigree, I am not a psychiatrist, but neither is Richard Dawkins. So we are, in a sense, equidistant from psychiatry. So what do you do when you're not an expert in the field and you're going to pronounce on it? Well, the first thing you do is be very careful. Be very careful, because the cardinal sin in academia is to pronounce on matters outside your field. And the danger, as you know, is that often people's confidence is inversely proportional to their knowledge, so that they pronounce extremely strongly on something they know nothing about. So I go carefully. And when somebody says to me, God is a delusion, and I'm aware, even Dawkins admits it, that this is a psychiatric term, I, of course, consult a psychiatrist. And what I discovered was fascinating. I went to the very top. Professor Andrew Sims is a past president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in London. And he's written a book, Is Faith in God a Delusion? And he comes to the conclusion, answer no. He said, of course, the contents of belief can be delusional, but faith in God as such is not a delusion. Not only that, and here I quote, the positive benefit of belief in God is the best kept secret of psychiatry. He says there's a major meta-study. Now, you know what an epidemiological study is. A meta-study is a study of studies. So you get all the evidence together from studies around the world, and you then assess the evidence for the whole thing. And the conclusion was that in almost every sociological area that you can name, drug abuse, loneliness, and all this kind of thing, failure of relationships, that belief in God has a positive effect. And Sims adds at the end, he said, if the evidence had gone the other way, it would have been front page news on every newspaper in the world. But because it supports belief in God as being positive for human flourishing, nobody knows about it. Certainly Dawkins shows no awareness of it. That's point number one. But now let's come to the objection. And Manfred Lutz, this psychiatrist from Germany, has written this very witty book called A Brief History of the Great One. And he says, if there is no God, then Freud's argument is brilliant, that religion is a delusion and God is a delusion if there is no God. That God is simply a projection of our desire to have a father figure in the sky, a crutch if we're feeling lonely and weak, and we need some solace, so we project that wish up into the sky, and we have this great father figure, God, if there is no God. But then he goes on. He says, of course, if there is a God, then it's atheism that's the delusion. Because atheism now represents the desire never to have to do anything with God. Never to have to meet God. And now I'm quoting a Nobel Prize-winning literature, Polish academic, Czesław Miłosz, who said atheism is the great opiate of the people. The desire never to have to face God for the consequences of our murders, our lusts, our desires, and our sins. So, said Manfred Lutz, the argument works both ways. If there's no God, God is a delusion. Freud's argument, brilliant. If there is a God, then atheism is a delusion. Freud's argument, equally brilliant. And now comes the bottom line. On the question, the substantive question, as to whether there is a God or not, neither Freud, Jung, or Frankl can help you. You've got to look elsewhere. You see, what the Freudian argument doesn't do is address the question. Is there a God or not? And that's the thing we have to decide. If there isn't, of course he's a delusion. But the question is to decide in advance, is there any evidence that there is a God? So that's the sort of preliminary remark I'd like to make here. And we'll come now a little bit to the science side of things, because of Dawkins and Hitchens' influence, and many others actually. There's a very widespread notion in the world today that science and God don't mix. I've just come from Australia, where we had huge gatherings of students just like this at all the universities. And they gave me the title, Cosmic Chemistry, Do Science and God Mix? I thought it was a brilliant title, because the impression that many students have, and many professors of course, is that science is here, God's there, they don't mix, and in the academy, please don't do God. Because that's outmoded, outdated, outthought, and utterly irrelevant for contemporary society. Well, I'm not convinced that that is the case. In fact, I'm convinced the exact opposite is the case. Very strongly convinced. I want to tell you a little bit why. First of all, the common idea that science and God don't mix must be a myth. Why? Well, take last year's Nobel Prize. A Scotsman won it. My, were they proud. I don't know what they're doing seceding from England now, but that's another matter. And I'm not prepared to handle any questions on that. But Peter Higgs won the Nobel Prize. Now, Peter Higgs, Higgs boson, you've all heard about it, and I may talk about it tomorrow, because it was called the God particle. And Lawrence Krauss, who I believe has been in South Africa, who's a world-leading astrophysicist, he claims that the Higgs boson is more important than God. So if you remind me tomorrow, I'll talk a little bit about that. But anyway, this is the idea that Higgs has shown there is no God. Now, Higgs doesn't claim any such thing. Peter Higgs is an atheist. But he does respect people who believe in God. But anyway, he's won the Nobel Prize for Physics. He's moderately bright, okay? Now, go back a few years to the same Nobel Prize for Physics, and Bill Phillips won it. He's a Christian. And I say, just half a minute. I thought science and God can't mix. Here are two people that have won the top prize in the world in physics. Their physics doesn't divide them. If you had both of them here giving lectures, one on the Higgs boson, the other in low temperature condensed matter physics, they wouldn't disagree about their physics. They'd be respecting and admiring each other's physics. So it can't be that God and science don't mix. Where is the problem? Well, I want to suggest this to you, that the problem is not at the level it's often portrayed, God versus science. The problem is real and the conflict is real. What level is it at? It's at the level of worldview. A worldview is your set of answers to the big questions. And in the debate in which I'm involved, there are two principal worldviews. The one is atheism, and the other is theism. And that goes back centuries. I mean, if we were at the time of the ancient Greeks, and you were all students in the school of Pythagoras or something like this, or the school at Athens with Socrates and Plato, boy, would I love to go and listen to them there. But you'd have had two worldviews presented to the class. You'd have had Democritus striding across the stage. Brilliant. He was the man who thought of the atom. Atomos, it cannot be cut. He thought of it. He was a genius. And he would have said to you, ladies and gentlemen, this universe is all that exists anyway, and it's composed of atoms and empty space. And as the atoms cascade through empty space, they form galaxies, they form worlds, they form you, and they form the idea of God, because there isn't a God. But then there'd be Socrates. And he'd say, well, yes, atom's fine, but there's more to it than that. There's transcendence. There are the gods, or there is God. And so coming up to us in the 21st century, from the ancient world, there are these two worldviews. They divide this audience. There will be people in this audience who lean to the side of materialism. That is Democritus's view. And there'll be those who lean to the side of theism, particularly Christianity. So it's exactly the same tension, but it's not a tension between science and God. It's a tension between worldviews. Atheism and theism, Christian theism, are diametrically opposed. The point to realize is there are equally bright people on both sides. There are Nobel Prize winners in physics on both sides. So you cannot just simplistically say, oh, it's a matter of, if you're a serious intellectual, you can't be a Christian. That cannot be the case. Now, there's more to it than that. It gets more interesting, of course, as you come forwards in history a little bit. Because here we are in a modern leading university here in Cape Town. And a lot of us are doing science. And that's really exciting. I hope there's a future Nobel Prize winner in this audience. We're doing science. Do you know where science came from? Modern science, I mean. It came from Christianity. You say, no, it didn't. Yes, it did. You see, look back. I remember I gave the first lecture in 75 years in Siberia in 1989. I gave the very first lecture on why I, as a mathematician, believe in a creator. And in my lecture, I just casually said to them, of course, I said, you know, as you look back, people like Newton, Kepler, Galileo, Babbage, Clerk Maxwell, all believed in God. And there was utter silence and anger on the faces, particularly of the heavyweight professors in the front row. They were very angry. So I stopped. I don't like angry professors. In fact, I don't like anybody who gets angry. I try not to get angry. We need a good debate. So I stopped and I said to this professor, oh, what's making you mad? And he said, you tell me that Newton was a believer in God. Why has nobody ever told us? I said, can't you guess? I mean, it ought to have been obvious in a communist regime why they hadn't been told. But you see, the irony of this, ladies and gentlemen, is Newton held a chair at Cambridge, as you know. One of his most famous successors is who? Stephen Hawking. You know that as well, don't you? The physicist in the wheelchair. Genius. I remember him at Cambridge. He was just ahead of me at Cambridge, and he's light years ahead of me in his brain power. And here's Newton, who believes in God, and Stephen Hawking, who says you can't be a scientist and believe in God. That puzzles me. What's happened in the intervening centuries? How can you sit in Newton's chair, as Hawking does, and say, if you want to be regarded as an intellectual, give up your faith in God? And yet Newton, who held that chair and was the pioneer of contemporary science, did believe in God. Now, I want to try to help you navigate the debate by trying to explain to you what has happened in just a relatively few minutes. What is it that has shifted? Well, the first thing is shifted is that Stephen Hawking is confused about the nature of God. Now, this may surprise you. He's confused a little bit about science. You may say that's a very daring thing to say, but still I say it. I've written a book and there's been no response to it yet after 3 years, which interests me. But there's confusion about God. You see, when I talk about God, many people, perhaps some in this audience, think that what I believe in is some kind of ancient Greek god of thunder and lightning. You know, they were scared of thunder and lightning. So they said that's God being angry, so you better not touch that stuff. But if you come to UCT and do lecture 1 on atmospheric physics, the God of thunder and lightning will disappear like so much smoke. Isn't that so? You don't need the God of thunder and lightning. We can describe in terms of electrostatics, in terms of atmospheric pressure, in terms of this and that. And so Hawking thinks that I believe in that kind of God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. So a little bit of advance in science and God disappears. Now I want you to follow this very carefully. If you define God like that, you've got to choose between God and science, because that's the way you've defined God. You see, many people are thinking of God as an alternative to science. And of course, if they think of God like that, you have to choose between science and God. But I have never met an intelligent Christian, indeed an intelligent Jew or Muslim, who believes in a God like that. You see, the God of the gaps is a fiction. It's an invented God. It's a delusionary God, which is abolished by science. You see, science gets rid of a lot of false gods, and that's a good thing. But you see, Newton didn't believe in a God like that. He didn't believe in a God of the gaps. He believed in a God who's God of the whole show. The bits we do understand and the bits we don't understand. And so advance in science, instead of pushing God out, brought God further in. And you know that, don't you? The more you know about engineering, the more, not the less, you admire the genius of a Rolls and a Royce. The more you know about art, not the less, the more you can admire the genius of a Rembrandt or a Picasso. Isn't that right? You don't dismiss them. The more you know, the more Newton knew, the more he admired the genius of the God who did it that way. He wasn't a God of the gaps man. Now that's the first point. That the God of the Bible, the God who created the whole show, is not threatened by the advance of science. He actually invented our ability to do it, but we'll come to that in a moment. So the motor that drove modern science, and this is more or less agreed by historians right across the spectrum. Alfred North Whitehead, summarized by C.S. Lewis, put it brilliantly. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, the motor that drove the foundations of the sciences that you're studying at UCT was belief in a rational God. And it's obvious why that is the case. If you're going to believe, all scientists are people of faith, by the way, every one of you believes that science is worth doing. That's your founding faith. Now, why would you believe that? Well, the pioneers believed it because they believed that there was a lawgiver behind the universe, and therefore it was worth doing science because you might be able to think God's thoughts after him, as Kepler put it. You might be able to find out what those laws were. So I find this very exciting. Far from belief in God hindering science, it was the motor that drove it. Now, I put this to Richard Dawkins in one of our debates, and he said, no big deal. He said everybody believed in God in those days. So, of course, science arose out of belief in God. But Richard Dawkins' world was limited to the West when he made that statement. Everybody didn't believe in God in those days. China was a pretty big country. And the Chinese developed brilliant technology, engineering, printing, fireworks. No abstract science. Why is that? And there was a genius at Cambridge, Joseph Needham, who was a chemist and he was a sinologist. He was an expert in China. He wrote their definitive dictionary, encyclopedia of Chinese technology. And for years he tried to explain, on the basis of neo-Marxism, an atheistic philosophy, why the Chinese had no abstract science. Because he was a neo-Marxist. He couldn't do it. And at the end of years of study, he came to the conclusion this. He said it has to lie in the fact that the Chinese lacked the unifying idea of a single creator who created a universe to run on laws that he'd built in. So the other side is evident, you see. It's not just that everybody in the West believed in God and so it was bound to happen. It didn't happen in places where they didn't have that concept. So you see, I'm not embarrassed, and remotely embarrassed. Richard Dawkins thinks I ought to be, but that's his opinion. I'm not remotely embarrassed in being a Christian and a scientist because arguably it was Christianity giving me my subject. And that's not a bad start, is it? Intellectually open. What a tragedy it is, and this is another topic, what a tragedy it is when people get the impression from some Christians that Christianity is anti-intellectual. It sits at the foundations of modern science, right in the middle. And if you look at the major universities of the world and look at their mottos, you'll discover that many of them are Christian. They're taken from the Bible. I'm at Oxford. Dominus illuminatio mea. The Lord is my illumination. The people that founded Oxford and Cambridge and all the rest of it were people who believed in God. They believed in study. They believed in investigating the universe. And it's a sad tragedy when in the contemporary world some Christians haven't grasped that the very first commandment is to love the Lord your God with your mind. We've forgotten it. So that's the first major point that I want to make. And the second one is that to just analyze very briefly why it is that Newton didn't make the mistake that Hawking's making. You see, that is now to do with the nature of science. And it's so simple. But if we miss this, we'll not understand what the debate is about. That is, it has to do with the nature of explanation. What does it mean to say that science explains? Now, when I went to school, I was so excited when I first learned the law of gravitation. I got even more excited when I learned to derive it, to derive the motion of the planets from it for university students. What I wasn't told at school, unfortunately, was the law of gravitation does not tell you what gravity is. Did you think it did? Doesn't. Nobody knows what gravity is. Newton didn't. He said he didn't. And nobody knows, and if you don't agree with me, consult Richard Feynman, who also won the Nobel Prize for Physics. You see, Wittgenstein it was, a brilliant philosopher who put his finger on the problem. And he said the greatest delusion of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature, when they're not. They're just descriptions. Now, they're brilliant descriptions on which we can make predictions. You can use the law of gravity to land a person on the moon without even knowing about Einstein's refinements. But you're no near to knowing what gravity is. So even at its own level, scientific explanation doesn't explain everything. Point number 2, why is the kettle boiling? Well, it's boiling because the molecules are being agitated by heat energy coming from a Bunsen flame transduced through the copper at the bottom of the kettle, and they're going faster and faster, and they're building up pressure, the steam is rising. That's why it's boiling. No, it isn't. It's boiling because I need a cup of tea. I'm glad you laugh, because immediately you perceive that there are 2 levels of explanation. Now, what would you think of me if I said the explanation, I want a cup of tea, contradicts the explanation that I've given you in terms of science? You'd say, don't be an idiot. But that's exactly what's happening. There's the how and the why, to put it crudely. Now, this needs refining, I know. And I've done so in one of my books. But just for the moment, the scientific explanation explains how. The personal agent explanation explains why. Now, let me put it this way. God is no more in competition with science as an explanation for the universe than Henry Ford is in competition with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for a motor car. You'd never dream of saying, well, I don't believe in Henry Ford because I've studied the physics of motor cars. You'd never dream of doing it. Yet I meet so many high-powered people that say, well, I've studied the universe, so I don't believe in God. But the God explanation is a person, agent, creator explanation. It's not even in the same category as a scientific explanation. Just as your scientific study of a Bunsen burner and boiling water will never, ever lead you to the intentions in my mind to have a cup of tea. Not even a scanning, tunneling microscope will do that for you. And so what I'm pleading for, ladies and gentlemen, is at the very start of this debate, we get a few things clear. Otherwise, we'll be constantly, God's a delusion, he's against science, all this kind of thing. That is fog. Absolute fog. It's intellectual fog. And it's being generated deliberately, I'm afraid, by certain people whom I wouldn't dare name. But I might next time. So the basic idea, where have we got today? One, the idea of God being a delusion works both ways, proves nothing. As was shown, by the way, I had a little spat in the newspapers, in our national press. Stephen Hawking, and I'll finish with this, I'll give you time for questions, and it'll lead to tomorrow. Stephen Hawking was asked what he thought of religion. And his reply was, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. So I was asked by the London Times to reply. So I said atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Now, there's no point in laughing. It doesn't prove anything. It just shows that these things work both ways. And as students, it's very important as you grow up intellectually, when you hear an argument that seems powerfully convincing in one direction, try and reverse it and see does it be equally convincing in the opposite direction, because the God delusion argument works that way. So I set it aside and say, what's the evidence? And I've turned first to history and shown that belief in God is the motor that drove science. I've contrasted that with Stephen Hawking's view that you've got to choose between God and science, and I've demonstrated, I hope that rests on 2 utterly profound mistakes. a fog and a confusion about the nature of God, and secondly, a confusion about the different levels of explanation that we've got. Science is very successful because it narrows the nature of its explanatory paradigm. But we must realize there's a bigger world out there. Science doesn't define rationality. It's not the only way to truth, or all your literature faculties would have to close tomorrow, and you wouldn't want that, would you? So, to sum up then, it seems to me that a very powerful historical case can be made that God played a central role in the development of modern science. Secondly, a powerful case can be made that the swing in the other direction, whatever else has generated it, it's been generated by an intellectual fog and confusion about the nature of explanation. If you want to hear any more, you'll have to come tomorrow. Thank you very much. Now, we have some minutes for questions, and let me explain what I'm going to do, because we've got all sorts of interesting questions buzzing around in your heads. And I know that every one of you is interested in the other person's question. So what I want you to do is put up your hand. I will collect a number of questions before I comment on any, so that we can relate the spectrum of questions to one another and try and get a balanced view, okay? So state your question briefly. It's a question, it's not a polemic. If you want to have a polemic, you could organize a lecture, that's fine. State your question, I will write it down, keep it brief, because the time you use is time taken away from somebody else. So do put up your hand and keep the questions on the topic. I'm not here to tell you the colour of elephants in Ireland. Okay, who's got, up there please? Yes? Okay, that's two questions. That's slightly cheating, but I'll take that. One question from now on. Who is the next person at the back there, please? Two.
I agree with you that God and science aren't exclusive, but doesn't science also contradict the Bible?
Example?
Like the creation.
Okay, three. Yes, please. Can you talk louder so they can all hear you? I'll repeat the questions though later.
In most of the talks, if not all, you seem to always bring up Richard Dawkins. So why is that?
Do you mean to say you don't know? Okay, I'll answer that. Okay, who's next? Yes, please.
Sort of all the arguments you mentioned seem to, if I was a member of like the wisdom faith, I could just use the same arguments. And all these religions are obviously logically incompatible because they all claim sort of a monopoly on truth. So why Christianity for you, other than the fact that you were raised in England, or I'm sorry, not sure about your background.
Ireland, if you don't mind. Ireland. Okay, I understand that. Right, one more. One more. Up there. Yeah, quite right. Okay, we'll have a look at these. Rohan's novels. That's a good variant of a question I've had many times. Okay, folks, let's have a look at these for a few minutes. Galileo and persecution. It's very interesting that you raise this. This is an iconic thing that's been raised for many, many years. And historians of science now discredit it completely as an argument that science and God don't mix. Why did they do that? Firstly, Because the Catholic Church, although it was far too long in apologizing for what it did to Galileo, they weren't the first people to attack Galileo. What is forgotten in this whole thing, and I worked with John Hedley Brooke, who's written definitive studies on the Galileo Incident, and I've read them and even lectured on them. It was the Italian philosophers first attacked Galileo, whether they were believers or not. And they attacked him because he was questioning the reigning Aristotelian scientific paradigm. Aristotle taught that there is an eternal universe, that the earth is fixed, it doesn't move. And everybody believed it, including the Christian church, who got on the bandwagon. So the philosophers questioned him first. Then the Christians got after him. And the irony is Galileo wasn't an atheist, either when he began or when he finished. So here was a believer in God, actually, who got the right ideas, we now know. So to use that as an example of this tension is far too simplistic, according to the historians. The second thing is Galileo was not wise at his own time, in the sense that he insisted on writing his scientific papers in Italian when everybody knows you should write them in Latin. Thirdly, he took the arguments of his erstwhile friend, the Pope, and he put them into his book, the arguments into the mouth of a character he called Simplicius, the fool. That wasn't the best bit of PR that's ever been seen. So there were all kinds of sociological factors. The Protestant reformers were showing too much sympathy for Galileo and so on. So if you read the history, and I suggest you do, let me quote the decision of one of our leading professors of the history of science. He said, "This is such a caricature that stimulates and keeps going the myth, what's called the conflict myth, that is that science and religion in conflict, that what I'd like to know is what really got it going, since the historical basis points the other way." So it seems to me that far from establishing the conflict myth, the Galileo story on investigation. Now, updating gravity by the Higgs boson, you see, Lawrence Krauss makes exactly the same mistake that Hawking makes. He wrote this thing in Time magazine or something, and I replied to it, where he said the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. So I wrote a little piece saying, arguably more important than God for what? Well, if you're explaining particle physics to UCT physics students, of course the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. You wouldn't even mention God. But if you're facing the question, why is there a universe at all in which Higgs bosons exist, then God is more important than the Higgs boson. It depends on the question you're asking. The advances in studying gravity haven't solved the question what gravity is, of course. But this kind of argument is not an argument against God. The Higgs boson is a wonderful discovery. And I summarized my article by saying, what shall we say about the Higgs boson? Well, I said, Higgs predicted it, CERN discovered it, and God invented it. We rightly celebrate the first two. What about the third? It's again that confusion of ideas. Now, I must move on rapidly. Always bring up Richard Dawkins. Well, yes, I do. And why do I do that? Well, for the simple reason he likes to be brought up. And he is by far the most influential atheist around the planet. Most people have read his books. That's why I mention him. I could mention loads of other people of whom nobody's ever heard. And since his books are the influential ones, I mention them. There are dozens of other people using his arguments. I was very amused recently. I went to his old school, and I thought this is going to be fun, meeting the students at Dawkins' old school. And sure enough, all the arguments came up. Who created the creator and so on, as if they were all little mini Dawkinses sitting there. So it's not because I have any personal animus against the man. None whatsoever, actually. You know, it's in another context, I talk a lot about Christopher Hitchens because people know about him. And I've had very friendly discussions with him. So it's not a question, I think that was probably behind your question, that I've a personal animus against him. Of course not. We're in the world of ideas, ladies and gentlemen. I will attack anybody's ideas as hard as I can. But I hope, as I look at them, each of them, as I look at you, I believe, whether you agree with me or not, that you are a person made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value, and therefore I need to be careful what I say and how I treat you. So that's the key to it, you see. Okay, thanks for that question. We'll move on now. The final question was about the Christian worldview integral to science and Rohan's novels. Well, the whole point, they're not commensurate. The whole thing is that explicitly these men argued that science could be done because this was a rational universe, because there was a rational creator. It's not a question of saying that certain books are relevant or irrelevant when they've nothing in their content about the nature of the universe or of God. This is their own view of their own science. And I take it very seriously, just as I will take equally seriously the view of Richard Dawkins about his own science, you see. So I don't think the objection has any effect on the situation at all. Now, there are two questions left, and they're huge questions. One, I agree with you about God and science, but doesn't science contradict the biblical story of creation, for instance? And it depends how long you've got, but I'll give you a very short answer to that. My answer to that is no. It doesn't, because the Bible happens to be a great deal more sophisticated than a lot of people realize. Let me take the simplest example at all. And now I make a confession. I hinted that I came from Ireland, didn't I? But what I didn't tell you was I come from the city Armagh, where there was an archbishop many years ago. And he worked out from the Bible, apparently, and he wrote a letter to the Vice-Chancellor at Cambridge saying, "Dear Sir, Adam was created at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 5th of October, 4004 BC, but I'm afraid I cannot give the information more accurately than that. Yours sincerely, Archbishop Usher." So that's where I come from. It's not where I come from intellectually, because I take the Bible seriously. So let's just, you think it contradicts, and the basic contradiction people feel, look, the current estimates of the age of the universe and of the earth are 13.8 or so billion, 4.5 billion, something like that, years. And the Bible claims that the earth is young. The Bible doesn't claim the earth is young. In fact, it's very careful not to claim it. If you read it, instead of just listening to second-hand opinion of it, and you're now about to listen to an opinion of it, so I'm going to encourage you to read it. It starts with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Isn't that right? And then there follow a sequence of days. Do you remember those days? Oh, those days. Yes, you remember those days. And each of the days starts with the words, "And God said, and God said." You remember that bit? Okay, that's the sort of literary scenario. But of course that means that in the beginning is not day one. And Hebrew has two tenses in the past that differentiate. And it's used here. The first statement, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," is independent of the sequence of days. Now listen to me carefully. No matter what you believe about the days, no matter what you believe about it, you still can't argue a young earth. Why? Because in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is, in the way it's written in Hebrew, separate from the sequence of days. So the Bible doesn't discuss the age of the earth. So let me put it this way. I believe everything Scripture says about the age of the earth, and it says nothing. So therefore, I'm very happy with the notion. They may change it, of course. They may discover that we were created yesterday in a virtual universe, but that's another matter. But I see nothing. This conflict is superficial, actually. Now, because many people ask me these questions, I've written a book on this. So a shameful bit of advertising is now going to follow. Sorry, a shameless. I'm not ashamed of the book. It's a shameless. 7 days that divide the world, where I've written about the days and everything else in some detail, because I'm passionate about science. And what I don't like to see is that young people who are brilliant in their science, they want to, as best they can, be committed to a full concept of the authority and inspiration of Scripture, and they feel that that's not possible. I feel it is very possible. So I want to argue from both sides and bring the thing together and provoke your thinking. Final question. I've only got a couple of minutes. A Muslim could use the same arguments. Why Christianity is at Ireland? That's a very good question, you know. And you know why people say that's a very good question? To give them time to think of an answer. But I had that question virtually on day one at Cambridge as a student. Somebody said to me, do you believe in God? And then they said, oh dear, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked you that. You're Irish. All you Irish believe in God and you fight about it. And I spent my life answering that question. Because I don't want to be fooled. And therefore, I have spent my entire life traveling the world exposing my faith to its opposite. Now, you're right in your first assertion. I get many very warm letters from Jewish writers and from Muslim writers. I had one just last week. Because the arguments for theism are common. So that's okay. But you rightly make the point that religions don't agree with each other. It is true. Leave Christianity out of it. Islam will never agree with Hinduism about the number of gods you can have. And you have to decide on the basis of evidence. Now, this is a huge topic. I'm just going to make one point about it. I go to this on the basis of evidence. My Jewish friends, of whom I have many, believe that Jesus died and he never rose. My Muslim friends, of whom I also have many, believe that he didn't die. I believe he both died and rose. Now, all three of those things cannot be correct. How do you decide? You have to decide on the basis of evidence. Now, I haven't time to give you that evidence today. This was not our lecture topic, but I've written another book about it. And if you look at the last chapter of Gunning for God, my most recent book, you'll find out about it. But our time's gone. We've got to exit this room. See you tomorrow. Thank you very much.